Before I went to seminary 25 years ago, some friends of mine and I decided that we would take a rafting trip down the Gauley River in West Virginia. I've been down several rivers in my life, canoeing and rafting, and it's really a wonderful experience. I was really looking forward to the trip. I remember we stood behind the huge outflow pipes beneath the dam where all that frigid water was rushing out. We jumped into our rafts and we took off. Now, like many rivers, there were calm areas where we could stop and along the way and swim and horse around, that sort of thing. But there were also other areas that were pretty rough, and then there were some that we actually had to carry our raft around. They were so dangerous. Now, if you've ever been whitewater rafting before, it can be an exhilarating experience, but not without some difficulties and dangers. It's important that everybody in the boat pulls together, especially when you're going through rough waters. We all knew where we were going, and we all knew what we needed to do to get there. We liked our guide, who was a young woman, and there was a certain amount of trust that had been given to her, but most of all, we trusted in one another. After all, it was mainly about us and our experience. Experiences like this help people to grow stronger together as a group of friends, a small community headed in the same direction. Now, one of my friends, a good friend of mine that went with us, he bets me about everything. And so, of course, he wanted to bet me which of us would fall out of the boat more. Fortunately, we weren't 5 minutes in, and he fell out. The only problem with that was I tend to be a little competitive, so I decided I was not going to fall out the rest of the trip. Well, that took some doing. We got to the very last rapid, and he had bet me a steak dinner, so I was very intent. So as we go through this rapid, I'm literally hanging out of the boat, and the only thing in the boat is my foot, but that still counts. Unfortunately, nobody told the guide. So fearing for my safety, she flipped my foot out of the boat, and out I went. Yeah, I was not real happy about that. She didn't realize I would have rather drowned than lose out on that bet. Now, one of the great things about these experiences is that they can build community. Now, I was thinking about that trip when I read today's gospel lesson. It was definitely a different kind of boat for the disciples, but some of the lessons are the same. Now, if you look up above you, you may recall that many churches are built in the design of an upside-down boat. All these rafters are like the ribbings of the bottom of a boat, and we all sit out here in the boat in this area we call the nave, which is Latin for ship, as in we are all in this boat together. Just like the disciples, we are in this boat with Jesus. They had Jesus right in front of them, and they needed to rely on Jesus and rely on one another. And we know we do so because that's what gets us through rough waters. Now, we all have different roles in this boat, but what is most important is community and taking care of each other. We will not always agree, and at times we may even hurt one another. And we may disagree in the direction of the boat at times. Like a raft on a river, there will be rough waters, and there will be smooth waters. And we will continue to move ahead regardless of what we are going through. In the coming months, we will continue to move ahead as a community, and it's important for us to care for one another. Where trust is broken, we must work diligently to repair that trust. And we do so because that is what we commit to when we all hop into this boat. And one of the great things about this part of the world is all the different rivers and lakes and mountain streams that we have, a place to enjoy the water. Being on the ocean can be a much different experience. The rough waters there are a little more serious sometimes. Now, one thing I learned about on the many fishing expeditions I got to go on when I was a kid and older was that if you're on a boat and you forget to take your Dramamine, you can pick out a spot on the horizon. And if you focus on that, you will have your equilibrium restored. It really works, and it helps calm your nausea because that spot on the horizon is constant and it does not change. So, I've always tried to remember that trick And every time I hear the lesson that we have this morning, I think of it. And I think of the disciples cowering the boat in fear. They had rough seas, and they forgot that Jesus was right in front of them, where they should be focusing. I try and remember that when I'm fearful or anxious and things rage around me. Now, if I can do that, I'm definitely less fearful and hopefully able to focus on forgiveness, compassion, and grace. Forgiveness, because I have been forgiven many times. Compassion, because that is what we all seek in this life. And grace, because we receive grace abundantly from God. And we are called to extend that grace to others, especially when life is difficult. Of course, it's easy to get along when things are going well and everybody is getting along. It's much more difficult when there is hurt or anger or sorrow. But those are the times that we need Jesus most of all, because he is who we follow. And we follow him as he leads us into forgiveness, compassion, and grace. Years ago, I worked in a small church in Texas that had been blown apart 6 years previously. Half of the congregation had scattered to the winds, and the remaining folks were struggling just to keep the doors open. But they continued. They endured through 2 consecutive interims, and in spite of that, they continued to do the work of Christ in the world. They even gave away money to outreach programs, which I found quite remarkable. They couldn't pay a whole lot, but I needed to stay in Austin with my family. And so I started working part-time, but the wonderful thing about that was I could go back to school and get my degree in counseling. I ended up working at a small nonprofit counseling center and the church for about 8 years. It was a wonderful experience in many ways. The church grew stronger and stronger, due mainly to the effort of a few, including my wife, who was the nursery director. As far as I know, they are still doing well, but not without their struggles like many churches. During that time, working at the counseling center, I met some fascinating people who taught me a great deal about life. Several stood out, and I started thinking about one in particular the other day. The first time that she arrived, she was visibly distraught. She could barely speak, and she handed me 6 pieces of paper that had on it handwritten notes about everything, as it turns out, that she thought was wrong with her and everything that she had done wrong in life. I read through the list, and it was admittedly quite impressive. It even included that she had been a recovering meth addict. I looked at her, and mastering all my years of education, training, and experience, I said the most therapeutic thing I could think of. I looked at her compassionately, and I said, well, like my father used to say, with all this horse manure around, there has to be a pony somewhere. You got to think about it. Fortunately, she did, and she found the humor in that, and we ended up working together for a year. The next week when she came in, she brought this beautiful picture that she had painted. It was of a dark forest. In the middle of the forest was a barely discernible light. Well, she kept working throughout that year, working to understand herself better, to forgive herself, and to forgive those who had hurt her. A year later, she came in after having painted a similar picture, another beautiful forest scene, but in the middle of it was a bright light that illuminated the entirety of the picture. It was a beautiful sight. Now, as soon as I realized that I'd be preaching today, I took a look at the readings, and I thought that it was probably more than coincidence that the gospel lesson is all about putting our trust in God and one another. The message should always be about putting our trust in God and one another, no matter what befalls us. That's a hard thing to remember when it seems that we are surrounded by chaos or fear or anxiety or uncertainty. But just like the disciples who were in the boat with Jesus as the storms raged around them, we have to remember that God is always with us, and so we put our trust in God. Now, I'm not going to stand up here this morning and tell you that everything is fine, but many things are. However, I realize some of you are grieving, and some of you are even angry. Some of you are fine, but we are all in this boat together. We have been through many rough waters over the last 8 years. But in spite of that, we are still here. Many of you are still tending to the business of being the light of Christ in the world, of being a parish family and opening our doors to others and worshiping together, sharing the light of Christ with the world. And that should not be taken lightly. Now, there is still more uncertainty ahead. I'm with you for a while as your vestry and your bishop decide the next steps. This is a time to put our trust in the leadership of this church and in our bishop, and to put our trust in God. I, for one, am confident that the future is bright, but it may take some time. The Christian life is not about certainty, except for the fact that we know we will eventually be with God, and we know that God is with us through whatever it is that we face. That much is certain. It's also certain that we will face challenges, either individually or collectively, because that is the way of this life. The true challenge is not when things are going well. The true challenge for us as people of faith is how do we react and how do we behave when things aren't going so well. We have commended ourselves in every way through great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute, as Paul reminds us. Whatever we may be feeling is important, but what we do with those feelings is more important. Do we seek the peace of God which passes all understanding? Do we find ways to process our emotions and continue to love those around us, even when we might be angry? Christopher and I remain available if you would like to seek us out for counsel. Maybe you have a trusted friend or a confidant or professional that you can speak to if you need to. Some of you have met in groups and you have processed your feelings together. We will be seeking more ways to do that. How we move through difficult times is what is important, so that we can look back and say that we acted compassionately, respectfully, and faithfully. We are all in this boat together. Some of the ride will be exhilarating. Some of it will be dull and even calm. And some of it will be difficult and at times disheartening. But we keep our focus on Jesus, who even calms the raging seas around us and within us. Thanks be to God. Amen.